Hi, my name is Phil Tajitsu Nash, and I teach Asian American Studies at the University of Maryland, and I serve as co-president of the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. I'm here today to talk about anti-Asian American violence and how that affects us within our community and within our country. I'd like to thank the people who made the play and people who produce it for you today. It's very important that we have a bridge between the culture and the real world. And it's so important that we discuss this issue because it's affecting our community and frankly, all communities. In fact, in one of my recent classes at the University of Maryland, a student said, "This is the worst anti-Asian violence it's ever been." And I asked the students to go to the board and split into 4 groups. One looked at the 18th century, the 19th century, the 20th, and the 21st century. And when they finished a 20-minute search and writing on the board, they said, "Oh my goodness, anti-Asian violence has always been here." And I said, "Yes, that's true." And then I said, "Please go back to the board and split into 6 groups. And please look at the history of violence against women, against other people of color, including the Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities, and against the LGBT community." And these 6 groups found that violence has been endemic. Unfortunately, we can never solve the problem of anti-Asian violence unless we also look at these other forms of violence, both structural and committed against individuals. With all that being said, anti-Asian violence is something that is studied in many classes of Asian American studies. We look back at individual incidents such as the massacre that occurred in Los Angeles in 1871, or the massacre that occurred in Rock Springs, Wyoming in 1885. But I prefer to not study Asian American history just as a series of incidents that you memorize, you take a test, and that's it. Anti-Asian history is like the history of any group of people, and it has 3 parts. It first starts with the successes, because obviously there's many people who've had success. We look at Dr. Leo in the play, who's become a medical doctor. We can look at the community and see people who've become Nobel Prize winners, champion skaters, and we celebrate these people during Asian American Heritage Month. And that's appropriate and wonderful. But unfortunately, there have been tremendous barriers that have prevented that success for too many people. And those barriers include laws, they include individual acts of violence, they include many structural problems that have been on the federal level, the state level, the regional level, and the local level throughout Asian American history. And in order to deal with those barriers, we need the third part of Asian American history. We need success, we need to look at the barriers, and then we look at how we as individuals and communities have overcome those barriers. And it's very important to have that third component because that's the activist component. That's the one that says we're not just passively serving as victims, passively serving as recipients of history. History is a verb. History is something that we act on. And we have to move that Overton window of public policy possibilities forward in a positive way. If you think about it, 100 years ago, the women of this country had very little political power. They were just trying to get the vote. They eventually got it. And now we have a woman sitting 1 heartbeat away from the presidency. But that happened because some people moved that window forward sometimes it was pushed backward, but they kept moving it. And likewise, we in the Asian American community and in all communities need to see ourselves as seizing that historical moment that we're living in. I'm not here to fight to end slavery. That was a battle that was fought back in the 1860s. I'm not here to fight the battles that Martin Luther King fought back in the 1950s and 60s. I'm here to deal with anti-Asian violence right now. I'm here to deal with the anti-LGBT violence right now. I'm here to try and make the world better and move that window for the Asian American community and for all communities. Asian Americans, unfortunately, have to deal with 3 myths that hold them back as they try to move forward in their history. The first one is called the perpetual foreigner. And what that means is that we can be here 3, 4, 5 generations and people still ask, "Where are you from?" "Gee, you speak mighty good English." Well, that notion that we don't belong, that we are from somewhere else, has historical roots. What happened was that people from the Middle East and people from Asia coming over here had to deal with a perception that they were always different, that they were never going to assimilate. And this notion of who is in and who is out starts with the notion of Greenwich Standard Time. If you think about it, when you look at your watch, you are looking at a time that was determined in Greenwich, England, just up the Thames River from London. Somebody said, I am the middle, and you can be east and you can be west. Now, the word Oriental comes from the Latin root oriens. It just means where the sun rises. Occidens means where it sets. It has no value judgment. It doesn't say better or worse. But somehow this word Oriental, this notion that we are always from this other place, has crept into our culture. And that word Oriental can still be used for carpets, but not for people. So we are perpetual foreigners. And when you have an East versus West paradigm, it means you who are from the South, Africa, South and Central America, you're not even part of that paradigm. And it's a worldview that has to end, because we don't want to have some people saying they are the middle and other people are outside of that. And we as Asian Americans are trying to move from this margin to the mainstream, but it's been a long, difficult struggle. And don't think that Europeans are the only ones who do this. If you speak Chinese, you know that there's a character for the Middle Kingdom. They think that they were the middle or are the middle. And Japan is where the land where the sun is rising. So every group has its centrisms, and that's fine. But when it's used chauvinistically against other people and trying to create a world order where some people are the middle and some are perpetual foreigners or some are not in the picture at all, that's something we have to address and change. There's also the model minority myth, which says that Asian Americans can be a model. Now, where does the notion of model come from? That means that Asian Americans in the 1960s were getting their jobs done, doing a good job, but being quiet and not asking for a raise, not making trouble. The African American, the Latinx, the women's community, other people were standing up in the 60s and saying, we demand our rights. And many Asian Americans were too, but that's not as well known. But what was happening was some people with power said, maybe we want those Asian Americans to be the model that all the others should follow. Just be quiet and stay in your place. Because historically, we've had a hierarchy in this country with whites at the top and blacks at the bottom and other groups fighting in the middle to try and be more white. The third myth that we have to deal with is conditional citizenship, which means that sometimes we're seen as this model and sometimes we're seen as this perpetual foreigner. And these massacres, these killings, these lynchings, these other things happen. Pushing people in front of subway cars, all these horrible things have happened before in history. And we have to change that. So we don't want to be perpetual foreigners. We don't want to be model minorities. We don't want to deal with conditional citizenship. Asian Americans would like to be treated just like every other person. We want to be judged on our own individual merits, not treated as a stereotype or something else. And this gets to the notion of how we deal with anti-Asian violence. When anti-Asian violence happens, there are 5 basic steps that you or anyone can deal with. First is ensure the physical safety of the victim and the family. Second is to find medical and mental health support for the person who has been hurt. Third is to preserve the case details of whatever happened. Like you saw in the play, if something happened, we need to preserve the case details. Fourth, discuss the case context with the victim and make sure that they have linguistic and culturally appropriate help. And fifth, be sure and report the incident, because one thing that's happened is these incidents are not reported enough. So there's always been an underreporting. And finally, if you're part of an organization or a community group or student group, I hope you will think about a 3-part model that I find useful for everyone, which is prevention, intervention, and legislation. And that means do programs like this, show this play, talk about it, help to prevent these things from happening, and help to get people thinking about how they're going to deal with it if it does happen. Second is intervene. How can you be the burstable bandwidth that is suddenly available to give culturally and linguistically available help to any person? And third, legislation. How can we change the laws to make things better for you at your workplace, at your school, and your community, so that we don't have to deal with these incidents of violence in our world today? So thank you very much for watching this. I hope you will have a very broad and robust discussion, and I hope that you will be part of a group of people who are out there trying to bring Asian American studies and ethnic studies and a real history of the United States to all of our schools, so that we can talk about what's happened in the past, not blame anybody for the past, but try to take ownership of our current world so that we can move that Overton window forward so that there will be peace and justice and safety for every person. Thank you very much.